The music room smelled like wax and silence. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting soft colors across the polished floors. The room was cathedral-like, high ceilings, columns of dark oak, and an echo that carried even the quietest breath. In the very center, beneath a skylight that made it seem almost holy, stood a black Steinway grand piano, gleaming as if it had never been touched. It hadn't been, not really, not by people like Talia James. A red velvet rope circled it like a moat. A small brass sign hung from the stand, "Do not touch unless authorized." No one ever said it aloud, but everyone understood what it meant. This piano was not for everyone. Talia stood just outside the circle, her backpack heavy on one shoulder, her shoes too quiet against the marble. She stared at the instrument with wide eyes, not in fear, but in awe. Her fingers twitched by her side, almost like they were remembering something old, something buried. This was her third week at the prestigious Valemont Academy of Music and Arts, a scholarship student, a gifted outsider, as the brochures liked to say, and no matter how well she played in class, or how hard she tried to blend in, she felt it, that line, that rope, invisible, but stronger than steel. Her clothes were always a little off-brand, her accent, a little too southern, her silence, too loud. She watched as two girls in neat uniforms strolled past her without a glance, giggling over something on their phones. One of them pointed at the piano and said, "That's Madison's. Her parents donated it. No one else is allowed to play it." They walked away without even noticing Talia standing right there, right next to it. But Talia noticed everything, especially the way her heart beat faster every time she passed that piano. She knew it wasn't just about the instrument. It was about who got to touch beauty, who was allowed to leave a mark. She pressed her hand gently against the rope, not crossing it, just feeling it. It was soft, warm from the sun, and it held her back like a wall she hadn't built but was forced to respect. Her fingers tingled. Music lived in them. Old music, music without permission, music that didn't ask. But in this place, music had rules, and Talia James was already breaking them just by dreaming. Talia's hands were not supposed to know music, not like this. They were the kind of hands that had scraped up bruises from moving boxes during apartment evictions, hands that had learned to be still when anger cracked through dinner plates, when her mother whispered, "Don't talk back, baby, let them think what they want." Hands that had wiped away tears in bathroom stalls at school because the world outside didn't make room for a girl like her. But when her fingers touched anything with keys, an old keyboard at church, a toy piano at the thrift store, even a cracked phone screen with a music app, something woke up. Not something learned, but something inherited, as if the blood in her veins hummed with melodies passed down through generations. She didn't remember the first time she played. It wasn't a moment, it was a becoming. She remembered sitting on her grandmother's porch, South Carolina sun pouring down like honey, as Grandma Bell clapped out rhythms with her palms and sang in a voice that made the wind pause. Gullah spirituals, blues that told stories without words, lullabies woven with survival. "Music's in you, baby," Bell had said, tapping Talia's little hand. "Ain't nothing they can take from you if it's in your bones." Talia didn't understand it then, but now, at 13, in a world that dressed beauty in money and tied access in red velvet ropes, she knew exactly what Bell meant. At Valemont Academy, talent was measured in auditions and exams, in resumes and recommendations, in summer programs in Vienna and tutors from Juilliard. Talia had none of that. She had second-hand sheet music with water stains, a keyboard with 2 broken black keys, and a grandmother's memory so strong, it sounded like a symphony in her chest. She had played at church since she was 6, gospel chords, call and response, raw sound that cracked open sorrow and lifted it into joy. She didn't play to impress, she played to feel, and that, more than anything, made her dangerous in this place. In class, she played only what was assigned, scales, etudes, pieces written centuries ago by white men in powdered wigs. Her fingers obeyed the notes, but her soul itched to break free. Every measure felt like a cage. She remembered last week, when she had played Chopin during theory class, her teacher, Mr. Harris, had raised an eyebrow. "You played that, emotionally." Then, with a slight frown, "Try not to over-romanticize. This is not jazz." Talia had nodded, but inside, something twisted. Because to her, music was feeling. Music was her language, not something to be recited, something to be lived. She looked down at her hands now, long, brown fingers with calluses on the tips. They had no right, in this school, to touch beauty. But they remembered what beauty really was. It wasn't the Steinway. It wasn't Madison Crane's perfect posture or her European competitions. It was Grandma Belle's voice in the heat of July. It was Mom humming softly in the dark after 3 shifts. It was a 6-year-old girl banging on a garage sale keyboard like it was the gates of heaven. Talia's fingers knew, even if the world pretended not to hear them. Let's take a short pause. If you're listening to this story, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from? Have you ever experienced something like Talia's story? We'd love to hear your voice. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's continue. The red velvet rope wasn't just a barrier, it was a message. It looped around the piano like a crown of quiet shame, not bold or aggressive, but elegant, polite. That was how exclusion worked at Valemont, never crude, never loud, just silent enough to make you question if you were the problem. It was Saturday morning. The corridors of the music wing were nearly empty, save for the occasional echo of footsteps and distant scales bleeding from practice rooms. Talia had come early. She said it was to rehearse for her theory test, but deep down she knew the truth. She wanted to be alone with the Steinway. She stood there again, 3 feet from the rope. Just like yesterday, and the day before. It was always the same. She'd approach the edge, heart pounding, and stop, as if something invisible held her back, something older than the rope. Shame, fear, the memory of being told you don't belong without words. Once, on her 4th day at the academy, she had asked another girl in class why the piano was always roped off. The girl, tall, blonde, the kind whose violin was probably imported from Vienna, had shrugged. It's Madison's. Her dad's on the board. She's, like, legacy. She gets special privileges. Talia hadn't replied. She just nodded and tucked that fact into her pocket like a stone. Legacy. How could a word sound so heavy and so hollow at the same time? In her old school, pianos were scarred and sticky. Kids waited in line to bang out bits of pop songs with 2 fingers. There were no velvet ropes, no whispered warnings, just sound and laughter and curiosity. But here, music had territory. She bent down now and examined the rope closely. Brass stanchions, velvet that was too clean, too perfect. It was like everything at Valemont, delicate, curated, and deeply aware of its own worth. Her reflection hovered in the polished surface of the Steinway's lid, her hair pulled back in a tight puff, her face, calm but storming beneath. She didn't look like the others, didn't sound like them either. But she had something they didn't, hunger. Not for fame, not for applause, for freedom. She reached out, not to cross, just to test. Her fingers brushed the velvet, and her breath caught in her throat. It was soft, silken, but in its softness was an accusation. You don't touch what isn't yours. And wasn't that the story of her life? You don't sit at the front. You don't ask for more. You don't touch the piano. That rope didn't just guard the instrument, it guarded permission. She pulled her hand back and folded her arms. But something inside her was shifting, growing. She could feel it, like a river rising behind a dam. And the rope was starting to look a lot thinner. The silence after a mistake is louder than the mistake itself. Especially at Valemont. It happened on Tuesday, during chamber music class. The room was filled with polished wood, expensive strings, and even more expensive egos. The kind of place where a wrong note wasn't just heard, it was remembered. Talia had been assigned to a trio with 2 other students, Felix Chang, who played cello like he'd been born in a conservatory, and Madison Crane, piano prodigy, donor's daughter, and owner of the Steinway. Talia was on violin. It wasn't her primary instrument. She'd only started 2 years ago, borrowing the school's practice violin. Its bridge was slightly warped, the bow worn, the case patched with duct tape, but she loved it, because in that sound, sharp, imperfect, full of breath and risk, she heard something honest. Felix nodded at her to begin. Talia lifted the bow, found her note, and let the sound out. It was wrong. Just slightly. A breath too high, a tremble too shallow, enough to stain the opening phrase like ink on silk. Madison stopped playing instantly. Her fingers hovered over the keys as if they'd been burned. That was not an A, she said, the corners of her mouth tightening with polite cruelty. Felix glanced between them. Awkward. Let's just start again. But Madison wasn't done. Can you even hear pitch? She asked. I mean, do you train with anyone? Or are you just self-taught? Talia swallowed. The room had gone still, the kind of stillness that draws blood. She could have explained that she practiced by ear, that she stayed late after church services to tune herself against the choir, that she played with instinct because no one ever taught her how to do it by rule. But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she lowered her violin and said, "Let's try again." Her voice didn't shake, but something inside her did. They restarted. This time, she played perfectly, not beautifully, just precisely, emotion buried, technique forward. When they finished, Madison didn't look at her. Felix gave a half-smile. Talia packed up quickly. As she walked down the hallway afterward, she passed the Steinway again, roped off, untouched, immaculate. She stopped, stared at it, and for the first time, she didn't just feel frustration. She felt resolve. That night, in her small apartment with thin walls and cold floors, she opened her window and let the city sounds in. Sirens, dogs, someone arguing on the street. She picked up her violin, not to practice the piece, to play, to break, to rage, to bleed music the way it demanded to be played. One wrong note, and Madison had tried to make her feel small. But Talia wasn't small. She was sharpening. Let's pause for a second. If you've ever been told you're not good enough because of where you're from, what you look like, or how you learned, leave a comment. What did you do in that moment? And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's keep going. There were sounds that lived beneath the floorboards of Talia's world, memories that never faded, just changed shape. On Sunday mornings, she used to sit at her grandmother's feet in the back row of Mount Zion Church, head tilted, ears wide open. The choir's harmonies would rise like smoke, soft and heavy, no sheet music, no formal training, just sound, earned, carried, echoed from one generation to the next. That was where her music had started, not in scales, not in Mozart, in witness, in grit. That morning, Talia skipped her usual walk through Vailmont's gardens. She didn't have the patience for manicured roses and crushed stone paths. Her mind was too full, her hands itching. Instead, she walked to the East Wing basement, where unused instruments were stored, forgotten cellos, dented French horns, an old upright piano with chipped keys and a missing pedal. It smelled of wood oil and dust. The lights flickered like old memories. She didn't plan to play. She just needed to be near something that wasn't pristine, something that wasn't owned. Her fingers hovered above the piano keys. Then, slowly, they descended. She began to play, not a song, not a piece, a feeling, a memory, the rhythm of footsteps on cracked church floors, the breath between a preacher's pauses, the low moan of her grandmother's hum when she thought no one was listening. The notes were uneven, raw, but they had soul. She didn't think. She just moved, let the pain in her chest pour into the wood. She didn't know how long she played. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching. Not until they stopped at the door. She turned, and there, leaning against the frame, arms crossed and face unreadable, was Professor Ellison. He taught composition, wore linen suits in winter and corduroy in summer. He rarely smiled, and he never came to this part of the school. Talia froze. "I'm sorry," she began, standing up fast. But Ellison held up a hand. "Sit." His voice was calm, deep, with that kind of authority that didn't need volume. She sat. He didn't move closer, just stood there, studying the keys, studying her. "You wrote that?" he asked finally. Talia hesitated. "I didn't write it. It just came." He nodded slowly. Then, silence. She hated the way silence could feel like judgment. But then he said, "Play it again." "What?" "That. Play it again. All of it." Talia's fingers trembled slightly as they returned to the keys. This time, she played slower, more intentionally. She shaped the notes, let them rise and collapse, let them ache. When she finished, Ellison walked over to the piano. He didn't praise her, didn't say it was beautiful. He simply placed a sheet of manuscript paper beside her. "Next time," he said, "bring this. That piece doesn't belong in your head. It belongs on staff lines." Then he turned and walked away. And just like that, something shifted. For the first time at Vailmont, someone didn't ask her where she learned, didn't test her with cold eyes, didn't make her explain herself. He just listened. She sat there for a long time after he left. The piano, old and broken, still warm beneath her hands. And she knew, her story hadn't started at Vailmont. But maybe, it would be heard here. It wasn't just the music that made Talia's hands tremble that evening. It was the feeling that something had shifted, an invisible line, something she couldn't touch but knew was there. In that moment, she had stopped being invisible. The piano was her secret, her rebellion. She hadn't told anyone, not even Felix, not even her mother. It was the one thing that no one could take from her. The one place where she could escape the voices that had always told her who she was supposed to be. After Professor Ellison had left, Talia returned to her apartment, sitting on the edge of her bed for hours, thinking. Her fingers still hummed with the music, and her mind, though tired, raced with possibilities. She could feel it in her gut, a force building, like a storm waiting to break, but it needed something to trigger it. The next morning, she was back in the East Wing basement, staring at the sheet of manuscript paper Professor Ellison had given her. She knew the piece wasn't finished, that it had more to say. She couldn't leave it incomplete. She sat at the piano, her fingers lightly tracing the keys before playing once more. This time, her hands didn't shake. She knew the notes now, and they flowed from her like water. They spoke of everything she had been, of struggle, of hope, of defiance. She let the music fill the space, filling it with her truth. But as the last note lingered in the air, something unexpected happened. The door to the basement creaked open. It was Madison Crane. Talia hadn't heard her approach, but there she was, standing in the doorway, arms crossed, as though waiting for an explanation. "What are you doing here?" Madison's voice was sharp, not mocking this time, but curious, with an edge of something else, something Talia couldn't place. Talia didn't stop playing, just finishing something. Madison stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she took in the room, the worn-out instruments, the dust that lingered in the corners, the unkempt space that could never compare to the perfection of her own practice room. "Doesn't seem like your kind of place," Madison said, her voice dripping with the same disdain that had always marked her words. Talia stopped playing. She turned slowly, locking eyes with Madison for the first time, the girl who had always looked down on her, who had assumed she didn't belong. "I don't need your kind of place," Talia said softly, but her words cut through the air like the sharpest of bows. For a moment, Madison said nothing. She just stood there, studying Talia, as if trying to find something to say, something to mock, but there was nothing. The silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, Madison walked out, and Talia let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew it didn't matter. She wasn't playing for Madison anymore. She wasn't playing for anyone. The music wasn't for anyone. It was hers. If you've ever had to fight for your place, to be heard, leave a comment below. What's your story? And if this chapter resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for the next part of Talia's journey. Now, let's continue. The days that followed felt like a dream, fragile, delicate, suspended in a moment where everything seemed both possible and impossible at the same time. Talia couldn't stop thinking about that afternoon in the basement, the moment when Madison had walked in, the way she had just watched. No words, no judgment, but there had been something in the air, something that Talia couldn't name, but that lingered like the faintest perfume, both beautiful and suffocating. As the week wore on, she spent more time at the piano, working through the pieces she had written. She had begun to shape something that might one day be called her music, but she also found herself avoiding people, not just Madison, but everyone. The quiet hum of the piano was enough. It was safer that way. The weight of silence began to settle over her like a heavy cloak. Every time she went out, every time she passed by the glossy, perfect world of Valemont, she could feel the eyes on her, the whispers, the judgment. And yet, when she sat at the piano, there was no judgment. There was no gaze to endure, there was only her. But that peace, that sense of solitude, was fleeting. One morning, as she walked down the long hall toward the East Wing, she saw Professor Ellison standing in front of the music room, waiting for her. His usually impassive face was unreadable, but there was something about his posture, something tight in his shoulders, that made her heart race. "Talia," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Her throat tightened. She hadn't expected this. She had hoped that the moment in the basement had been enough, that Ellison wouldn't press her any further. But here he was, asking her to confront the thing she had been avoiding. "About what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked around, as if making sure no one else was watching, before guiding her into an empty classroom. The room was cold, the only sound the echo of their footsteps on the tiled floor. "Talia, you're talented," he said, once they were seated. "But I don't think you fully understand the consequences of what you're doing. Your music, it's not just an expression, it's a statement." Talia froze, her pulse quickened, and she instinctively reached for her bracelet, the one her grandmother had given her. She twisted it nervously around her wrist, trying to focus. "You're not just playing for yourself," Ellison continued. "The world you've walked into doesn't have room for someone like you. It doesn't understand what you're trying to say. And that makes you a target. A target. The word felt like a blow. Do you think I should stop? She asked, her voice barely audible, but filled with defiance. No, Ellison said, his eyes hard. I'm telling you that you need to be prepared. People won't like what you're doing. They'll try to shut you down. They'll try to make you small. And if you're not careful, they'll succeed. The words settled into her chest like a stone. I'm not afraid, she whispered. Ellison's expression softened. Just for a moment. You should be. The room felt suddenly smaller. The walls seemed to close in, and Talia felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. There was no escaping it now. She had started something that couldn't be undone. Her music was out there, raw and real, and now, there would be a price to pay. If you've ever been told to be quiet, to stay in your place, share your thoughts in the comments below. How did you fight against it? And if you want to see what happens next in Talia's journey, subscribe for more. Now, let's continue. Talia had thought that silence would give her peace. She had believed that staying in the shadows of the music room, locked away from the chaos of the world, would somehow protect her from the pressure. But now, as she sat in the dim light of the piano room, the weight of Ellison's words pressed on her chest. You are a target. Those words kept echoing in her head, making the air feel heavier, more suffocating. She had been prepared for the challenges of being at Valemont. She had expected the stares, the whispers, the subtle judgments. What she hadn't expected was the crushing reality that the more she played, the more she exposed herself to the world, and the more the world would fight back. The following week, Talia faced her first true test. It began like any other day. The campus was buzzing with the usual chatter, students hurrying to class, couples strolling lazily through the courtyard, but there was something in the air, a sense of anticipation, something that made the hairs on her neck stand up. She walked to the east wing, but before she could even reach the entrance, she was stopped. A group of girls, including Madison, stood blocking the door. Madison's face was calm, but there was an undeniable sneer in her eyes. You think you can just play here, like you belong? She asked, her voice sharp and taunting. Talia stood tall, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, but nothing could have prepared her for the cold reality of standing face to face with the girl who had always treated her like she was nothing. I belong here, Talia said, her voice steady, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her. Madison stepped closer, her presence looming over Talia. No, you don't. You're a joke. You don't belong in this world. You're just a girl from nowhere, pretending to be something you're not. The words stung, each one like a slap against her skin. But Talia didn't flinch. She had come this far. She couldn't back down now. I don't need your approval, Talia said, her eyes meeting Madison's with unwavering defiance. I don't need anyone's approval. There was a brief silence, as if Madison was waiting for Talia to break, to show weakness, but Talia stood firm. Finally, Madison sneered and turned away, her group following closely behind her. But as they walked off, Talia's mind began to race. She had stood up for herself, yes, but there was something in her gut that told her this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. And then, as if on cue, she saw the familiar face of Felix. He had been standing near the courtyard entrance, watching. Everything okay? He asked, his voice low, but full of concern. Talia nodded, though her heart was still racing. It's fine. Just, people being people. Felix frowned, his brow furrowed. You know this is bigger than that, right? This isn't just about Madison or anyone else. It's about you and the choices you're making. You've already set things in motion. Talia, there's no going back. Talia swallowed hard. She had always known this. In some quiet corner of her mind, she had known that once she took the leap, once she let her music be heard, there would be consequences. But hearing Felix say it aloud made it feel so much more real, so much more dangerous. I don't care, Talia said, her voice growing stronger. I can't let fear control me anymore. Felix studied her for a moment, then gave her a small, approving nod. Just remember, no one does this alone. You don't have to face everything by yourself. Talia's chest tightened at his words, but she nodded back. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing, she couldn't turn back now. The days felt like they were slipping through her fingers, faster than she could hold on. Every morning was a blur of rushing to class, avoiding the stares, the whispers, and the growing sense that she was a stranger in a world that refused to accept her. Talia had been pushing herself harder and harder at the piano, each note a defiance, each chord a promise. The music had become her armor, her shield against the world that felt too sharp, too cruel. But the harder she played, the more the weight of everything seemed to bear down on her. The pressure was suffocating. By the time the weekend came, Talia was exhausted. The weight of her own thoughts was enough to make her head spin. It wasn't just the whispers of the students around her or the constant reminder that Madison and her friends were waiting for her to fail. It was something deeper, something darker. She needed to escape. One evening, after another long practice session in the music room, Talia left the campus. She walked out into the cold night, her breath visible in the air, and found herself wandering through the streets of Valemont. She needed to clear her mind, to be alone with her thoughts. As she walked, her mind kept drifting back to that moment, the moment when Madison had taunted her in front of the music room, the way Madison had looked at her as though she was beneath her. It had been so easy for Madison to dismiss her, to make her feel small, like she didn't matter. But Talia did matter. Her fingers itched to play again, but she wasn't sure if she could anymore. The doubt had begun to creep in, like a shadow that followed her wherever she went. What if Ellison was right? What if she wasn't cut out for this? What if the music she created wasn't enough? What if it was all a mistake? Just as the doubts began to consume her, she turned a corner and found herself standing in front of a small, dimly lit cafe. The warm glow of the lights through the window beckoned her inside. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The cafe was quiet, almost empty, except for a few patrons scattered at tables, their voices low. Talia walked to the counter and ordered a coffee, trying to settle her nerves. As she waited for her drink, her eyes wandered over the room, landing on a familiar face in the corner. It was Felix. He was sitting at a small table, his sketchbook open in front of him. His eyes were focused, but when he noticed Talia, he smiled and waved her over. "Hey," he greeted her warmly, as she walked over to his table. "What's going on? You look like you're carrying the weight of the world." Talia sat down, her heart racing. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Felix. Everything feels wrong. I'm not sure I can keep doing this." Felix studied her for a moment before speaking. "You're not alone, Talia. You don't have to carry it all on your own. You have people who care about you, who see you for who you really are." Talia let out a shaky breath. "But what if they don't understand? What if all this, what I'm doing, it's just a mistake? What if I'm wrong?" Felix reached out and placed his hand on hers, his touch steady and warm. "You don't get to decide if it's a mistake just yet. You're still in the middle of it. You haven't finished yet. Just take it one step at a time." Talia nodded, her eyes welling up with tears she had been holding back for days. The weight of everything she had been carrying finally felt like it was too much. She wanted to be strong. She wanted to prove to everyone that she could do this. But she was tired. So tired. "I don't know if I can keep going, Felix. I'm scared." Felix's gaze softened. "You're allowed to be scared, but you don't have to be alone in it. We'll figure it out together, okay?" Talia smiled through her tears, feeling the warmth of his words wrap around her like a blanket. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way through all of this, a way to keep going. The air felt heavy the next morning. Talia had tried to shake off the lingering weight of the night before, but it clung to her like a shadow, following her into every corner of her day. Her conversations felt muted, as though everyone around her was speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Valemont was no longer just a school to her. It had become a battleground, one where every day was a new fight. The weight of her music, the expectations, and the doubts were becoming too much to bear. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. She had no choice. By the time she reached the music building, she was already exhausted. Her mind was numb, her hands trembling from the pressure of it all. She pushed open the door and entered the room, the familiar sound of the piano welcoming her. But today, it felt different. It felt distant, like it was mocking her, reminding her of everything she was trying to outrun. As she sat down at the keys, the door to the music room opened, and Talia froze. Madison walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her presence as commanding as ever. Behind her were the familiar faces of her friends. They stood in the doorway, blocking the light, like vultures waiting for a wounded animal to collapse. Madison's eyes glinted with malice as she approached the piano. "I thought you might be here," she said, her voice laced with venom. "I heard you were getting a little too comfortable, like you actually belonged in this space." Talia swallowed hard, her fingers hovering over the keys. She wanted to ignore Madison, to pretend she wasn't there, but it was impossible. The tension in the room was palpable. "I don't need your approval," Talia said quietly, trying to steady her voice. Madison laughed, the sound echoing through the room. "Approval? Oh, sweetie, you don't even know what you're up against. You think you can just waltz in here and take over? You think you can just play like you belong?" The word stung, but Talia held her ground. "I belong here," she said, her voice gaining strength with each syllable. I've worked for this. You can't take that from me. Madison's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Talia saw something like a flicker of doubt in her gaze. But then, like a predator closing in for the kill, Madison smiled and leaned in closer. You really think that little piano means anything? Madison asked, her tone dripping with disdain. That thing? It's just an instrument. You're nothing. Just a girl who thinks she's special because she can play a few notes. The insult hit harder than Talia expected, but she refused to let it show. She knew Madison was trying to provoke her, to make her snap, but she wouldn't let her. Not today. I'm not going anywhere, Talia said, standing up from the piano. This is my space, and you'll have to get used to it. Madison's eyes burned with fury, and for a moment, Talia thought she might strike her, but instead, Madison stepped back, sneering. We'll see about that, she said, before turning and walking out of the room with her entourage in tow. Talia stood there, the room feeling colder than it had before. The silence after their departure was deafening. She had fought back. She had stood her ground, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the calm before the storm. She turned back to the piano and sat down, her hands once again resting on the keys. She played the first few notes of a familiar piece, but her mind kept drifting. The weight of Madison's words, the look of disdain in her eyes, was enough to cloud her thoughts. And yet, as she continued to play, something inside her began to shift. The music didn't sound the same as it had before. It felt different now, like the notes were no longer just a way to escape. They were a way to fight back. Talia's fingers moved faster, more determined now. She wasn't just playing to escape anymore. She was playing for something greater, something that belonged to her, something no one could take away. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her unstoppable. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of music, tension, and unexpected victories. Talia had thrown herself into her practice like never before. Each note she played a declaration of her resolve. The whispers at school continued, but now, when Madison and her clique made their snide remarks, Talia didn't flinch. She played louder, stronger, as though her music was speaking louder than any of their insults. Every day after school, she locked herself in the music room, pushing herself beyond her limits. But with every drop of sweat, every aching muscle, her confidence began to grow. The music that had once felt like a heavy burden now flowed through her like a river, smooth and unstoppable. And then came the day of the recital. Talia had always known that it would be a defining moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. The auditorium was filled with people, the room buzzing with excitement and nerves. She stood backstage, hands trembling, her heart racing in her chest. But as the time to step out onto the stage drew closer, something inside her shifted. She wasn't scared anymore. She was ready. When her name was called, she walked to the center of the stage, her steps steady despite the pounding in her chest. She glanced briefly at the audience, Madison's cold stare, her friends' mocking smiles, but instead of shrinking back, she lifted her chin, standing tall. This was her moment. As the lights dimmed and the first few notes of the piano echoed through the auditorium, Talia closed her eyes and let the music take over. She didn't just play the piano. She became the music. Every chord, every melody was a part of her soul, her triumph, her defiance. She poured every ounce of emotion into the piece, the music speaking for her in a way words never could. The audience fell silent, captivated by the power and grace of her playing. They could feel the energy radiating from her, the passion that had been building up inside her for so long. She was no longer the girl who had been mocked and belittled. She was a force of nature, unstoppable and fierce. As the final notes reverberated through the hall, Talia opened her eyes. She stood there for a moment, the silence hanging heavy in the air, before the crowd erupted into applause. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, and for a split second, she didn't know whether she was still standing or flying. Madison and her friends were silent, their faces unreadable, but in that moment, Talia didn't need their approval. She had proven something much more important. She had proven to herself that she was worthy. She was capable. She was more than the girl they had tried to tear down. As she left the stage, Felix was waiting for her backstage. His eyes were wide with pride, his smile impossible to miss. "You did it," he said, his voice full of awe. Talia smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. "I did," she whispered. The rest of the night was a blur of congratulations and praise, but through it all, Talia's mind kept going back to that moment on the stage. She had taken the first step toward something bigger than herself, and there was no turning back now. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was playing her life, every note a reminder that she had earned her place. Months passed, and things at Valemont slowly began to change. The whispers that had once followed Talia now faded into the background, replaced by respect. Her victory at the recital had reverberated through the halls, and everyone knew that she was no longer just the girl who had once been mocked. She was a force to be reckoned with. Madison and her friends, though they still tried to hold on to their old ways, couldn't quite regain the same power they once had. They watched from the sidelines as Talia's presence grew, as her music became a language of its own, one that spoke of strength, resilience, and unwavering determination. Talia had become a symbol at Valemont, a living testament to the power of perseverance. But she knew that the true victory wasn't in the accolades or the applause, it was in the quiet moments, the small victories that no one saw but her. It was in the way she now walked with her head held high, the way her fingers flew over the keys with a confidence that had once felt impossible. One day, as she was walking through the school's courtyard, Felix caught up with her. His eyes sparkled with a kind of pride that made her heart swell. "You've changed things here," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone." Talia paused, looking around at the students, some of whom were now playing instruments in the same music room where she had once struggled. It was a place of growth, of acceptance, a place where everyone had the chance to be heard, no matter their background or their struggles. "I didn't do it alone," Talia replied, her voice steady. "This place was always meant to be a place of music, not of judgment." Felix nodded, a look of admiration in his eyes. "You've made sure of that." As the year came to an end, Talia stood on the stage once again, but this time, it wasn't for a recital, it was for graduation. The entire school had gathered to celebrate the students who were moving on to the next chapter of their lives. Talia's parents were there, beaming with pride, and for the first time, she truly felt like she belonged. The principal stepped forward, microphone in hand, and called Talia's name. There was no longer any question in anyone's mind. Talia had earned her place, not just as a student, but as a part of something bigger than herself. She was a legacy in the making. She walked up to the stage, her steps confident and sure. As she took the microphone, the room fell silent. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had once doubted her, those who had tried to break her. But now, she stood tall, stronger than ever. "Music has always been my voice," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "But it's not just the music that speaks, it's the way we let our stories be heard. We all have something to say, something to give, and no matter what anyone tells you, you belong here. We all do." The words resonated through the crowd, and for a moment, the entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Talia looked out at her peers and saw something in their eyes. It wasn't just admiration, it was understanding. They had all been through something, and now, they were united in a shared experience. Her music had connected them, and through that connection, they had all found their own strength. As she stepped down from the stage, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was only the beginning. She had created something here, something that would last long after she was gone. She had left a legacy, not just through her music, but through the way she had inspired others to find their own voices. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Talia wasn't afraid. She had learned that no matter how hard the road may seem, the strength to overcome had always been inside her. All she needed to do was believe in it. And so, she stepped into the next chapter of her life, with music in her heart and the world at her feet.